Here we are again, ladies and gentlemen. So, in the last chapter, chapter 6, we saw all hell break loose in Birmingham, Alabama. We saw just an absolute nightmare of police stupidity with the use of dogs and fire hoses against young civil rights protesters. Now, moving on to chapter number 7. This one, there's only one question here, but we need to speak about the Freedom Rides and the group on it known as the Freedom Riders. So in 1961, a whole bunch of black and white individuals get onto buses in the American North where things were desegregated, right? They didn't have Jim Crow laws in the North. So to test Jim Crow laws and segregation, these Northerners got onto buses and rode deep into the American South to basically almost shame the segregationist ways of the Jim Crow laws, right? And the American South. And as these freedom riders rode deeper into the American South, they were not greeted with kindness. Initially, everything seemed good, and then they get into Alabama. Anniston, Alabama is the first attack on the Freedom Riders. The bus driver pulls into the station, and there's approximately 200 screaming racists and Klansmen waiting for them. So the bus driver decides to keep going. And as he's driving past some of these Klansmen, they actually slash his tires, and then the bus eventually breaks down because it can't go anymore, right? And as the bus is broken down, one of the windows is smashed out and a firebomb is tossed onto the bus. Now, after a firebomb was tossed onto the bus, they actually held the doors shut so that the people inside couldn't get out in the hopes that they would burn to death. Now, no one knows why. Eventually, they let them out, but the people on board the bus did in fact get out. Some suggest that a passerby had a gun and threatened the Klansmen holding the door. Another account suggests that a fuel tank looked like it was going to explode and they didn't want to be a part of that explosion. Either way, thankfully, the Freedom Riders got out, but not after getting one heck of a good scare. After that, the Freedom Rides continue on because to turn back and tuck your tail and go back north would be like an admission of defeat. So they continue on and they arrive in Birmingham, Alabama. In Birmingham, we of course have Eugene Bull Connor, the public safety commissioner, who is kind of watching everything going on, and he promises Klansmen that they'll get 20 minutes with the Freedom Riders before the police show up. So Klansmen are waiting in Birmingham with axe handles, iron pipes, bike chains, etc. And of course, what happens? Violence against the Freedom Riders. But they do not tuck tail and head back north. They keep going. Eventually, President Kennedy, right, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, is rather concerned with what he is seeing. He thinks that it makes America look bad. And remember, it's 1961. The Cold War is going on in amongst all of what's happening during the Civil Rights era. And President Kennedy wants a cooling off period. So he dispatches a man by the name of John Siegenthaler, who is a employee of the Justice Department, in the hopes that if there's a government agent on the bus, that violence won't be perpetrated against it. And he was wrong. Siegenthaler, once he gets on the bus, right, they continue to travel. He gets attacked too. You can see the image of Siegenthaler up above with his mouth bloodied, with John Lewis standing beside him as well. And then, guys, after this, President Kennedy dispatches 400 U.S. Marshals to escort the Freedom Riders wherever they are in the South to make sure that they're safe. And the really important thing that the Freedom Rides and the violence of it showed President Kennedy was how important the civil rights was to the American agenda. And President Kennedy started to really figure out that civil rights was now probably the most pressing issue in the United States of America. So domestically speaking, I mean, foreign policy wise, the Cold War is still going on. But domestically speaking, the civil rights movement became a very important thing for President Kennedy. And of course, he wants to introduce the Civil Rights Act, but that is not so. So because he warms up to civil rights, he wins a second presidency, and he gets a huge amount of support from African American voters. And it's believed that, because he's talking about it, that President Kennedy is going to introduce something called the Civil Rights Act. But that is not to be, because in November of 1963, November 22nd to be exact, while visiting in Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy, unfortunately, is assassinated. And what we'll see from here, guys, is a new president come into power. His vice president becomes the president, right? Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, becomes the president of the United States of America after this. And he follows through with President Kennedy's civil rights agenda, which is awesome to see, right? So yeah, we'll check out the March on Washington in the next chapter, and then we will eventually learn about the Civil Rights Act in chapter 10 after we talk about Mississippi Burning and Freedom Summer. Okay, let's keep it going, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you're learning. Hope your brain is growing. Hope those dendrites inside the gray matter are connecting, making those neural connections, making you smarter every single day. Peace. Love you guys. Stay cool.